begins in silence. A bare concrete room. A man stands behind a clipboard watching another man scream, not from pain but from something deeper, something that's breaking inside him. The air smells of sweat, fear, and confusion. A stopwatch ticks in the background, and on the other side of a one-way mirror, someone whispers, "Keep going. What you're about to hear isn't fiction." These are not scenes from horror films or dark thrillers. They happened. Conducted by men in lab coats. Approved by universities, governments, and military agencies. Each one began with a question: how far can the human mind go? But somewhere along the line disappeared. It started as a simple study. Dr. Philip Zimbardo, a psychologist at Stanford University, wanted to understand the psychology of power. What happens when ordinary people are given authority over others? He gathered 24 healthy, intelligent college students. Randomly, he assigned half as guards and half as prisoners. The experiment would last 2 weeks, he said. It lasted 6 days. They built a fake prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology building. Concrete walls, steel bars, uniforms, numbers instead of names. At first, everyone laughed. They knew it was a game. But within 24 hours, something changed. The guards began enforcing real punishments. Push-ups, solitary confinement, sleep deprivation. The prisoners, stripped of their identities, began to obey. They cried. They begged. Zimbardo, the scientist, watched from above. He told himself it was all in the name of research. But when one prisoner had a full mental breakdown, the illusion shattered, or maybe it became too real to break. By day 6, the guards were unrecognizable, shouting, cursing, forcing inmates to simulate acts of degradation. Zimbardo called it off, shaken. He realized his experiment had turned into something monstrous. But one question lingers even now. If cruelty can grow from nothing in less than a week, what does that say about who we really are? In the frozen plains of Manchuria during World War II, there was a facility so secret it was erased from maps. Its name was Unit 731. Here, Japanese military doctors under General Shiro Ishii conducted medical experiments on prisoners of war, Chinese civilians, Russians, Koreans, and sometimes even Allied captives. But what happened there defies language. Subjects were infected with plague, anthrax, and cholera on purpose. They were dissected alive without anesthesia, their organs removed to study disease progression. Others were tied outside in sub-zero temperatures until their limbs froze solid, then thawed with boiling water, just to see how tissue reacted. Witnesses described screams echoing across the compound every night. Guards referred to victims as Maryuta, logs. When Japan surrendered, the truth should have come out. But it didn't. The US government secretly granted Ishii and his scientists immunity in exchange for their data. The findings were buried in military archives, labeled vital to biological warfare research. No one was punished. No graves were marked. So the question remains, when horror serves science, who decides where the line is? In a small orphanage in Davenport, Iowa, a group of children sat nervously in a classroom. They didn't know they were part of a speech experiment. Wendell Johnson, a respected speech pathologist, believed stuttering wasn't genetic, it was taught. To prove it, he assigned graduate student Mary Tudor to divide 22 orphans into 2 groups. One group was praised for fluent speech. The other was told they stuttered, harshly corrected, humiliated for every word. Within months, some children who spoke perfectly fine before began stuttering uncontrollably. Others stopped speaking altogether. The trauma lasted a lifetime. The research was never published during Johnson's life. For decades, it hid in dusty archives under the name The Monster Study. In 2007, the state of Iowa issued an apology, but no amount of apology can return those lost voices. Can words alone destroy a child's mind? Or did this experiment only reveal how fragile the mind already is? At the University of Wisconsin, psychologist Harry Harlow was obsessed with one question: what is love? To find out, he took newborn rhesus monkeys from their mothers and placed them in isolation. Some were given a cloth mother, a warm, soft mannequin. Others, a wire mother that provided milk but no comfort. The monkeys clung desperately to the cloth figures, starving for affection more than food. Then came the true horror. Harlow built a device he called the Pit of Despair. A steel cage that allowed no light, no touch, no sound, just endless reflection. He placed infants inside for weeks, months, even years. When they emerged, they were broken. They rocked themselves, screamed until their throats tore, or simply stopped moving altogether. Many never recovered. Some mothers, raised this way, later killed their own offspring. Harlow claimed he had proven that love was essential for survival. But what he actually proved was darker. Even in the pursuit of understanding love, cruelty can become the language of science. In Denmark, over 100 orphans were unknowingly used in a social experiment. Psychologist Peter Neubauer wanted to see how isolation affected intelligence, language, and emotional development. Infants were deliberately separated, some placed with foster families, others confined to state-run orphanages. Certain children were kept almost entirely alone. Minimal touch, no affection, no speech. What happened next was beyond prediction. Children raised without human interaction lost the ability to speak. Their IQs plummeted. Some became catatonic, staring blankly for hours. A few grew violent, attacking their own reflections in mirrors as though trying to break free from themselves. The files were sealed for decades. Many of the children never learned they had been part of a study. By the time it surfaced, most of the experimenters were dead. So what happens to empathy in a world that treats children like data? And how many such experiments still hide behind government doors? At the University of California, Los Angeles, researchers studying schizophrenia wanted to understand what happened during a natural relapse. Their method: take stable patients off their medication. Participants were told it was safe. They weren't told that the goal was to watch them spiral back into psychosis. Some began hearing voices again within days. Others became paranoid, believing staff were conspiring against them. One patient tried to escape through a hospital window. Another took his own life before the experiment concluded. The data was published in psychiatric journals. The experiment was declared insightful. But among the families, it left a trail of trauma and unanswered questions. Can madness ever be studied ethically? Or does observation itself become the cruelty? During and after World War I, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps sought to test soldiers' tolerance to chemical agents. The method was brutally simple: lock them in chambers, fill them with tear gas, and record their reactions. Thousands of young men were exposed, coughing, choking, vomiting as gas burned their lungs and eyes. Some were left permanently blinded. In some cases, the subjects weren't even volunteers. They were prisoners or men of color recruited under false promises of pay. Declassified records show that these experiments continued into the 1960s, disguised as defense research. The government later admitted the studies contributed little to safety knowledge. The human body was simply the easiest test subject. If those walls could speak, what would they say between the coughing, the screaming, and the silence that followed? In December 1949, residents of Washington state noticed a strange metallic smell in the air. Livestock fell ill. Radiation monitors spiked. What no one knew, the U.S. government had just released radioactive iodine-131 into the atmosphere. It was called the Green Run. The goal? To test airborne radiation detection systems. Thousands were unknowingly exposed to fallout from the Hanford nuclear reservation. The event was kept secret for decades. Only in the 1980s did documents reveal the truth. Pregnant women, children, farmers, all contaminated without consent. The Department of Energy later admitted that no medical follow-up was conducted. How many invisible scars lie buried in the soil, in the bones of those who never knew they were test subjects. It began in a California high school classroom. History teacher Ron Jones wanted to show his students how fascism could arise, even in a democracy. He called it the third wave. On the first day, he imposed strict discipline, posture, salute, obedience. The students laughed at first. By the second day, they were silent. By the third, they began reporting classmates who broke the rules. Within 5 days, over 200 students had joined. Jones had created a movement, complete with banners, mottos, and spies. When he revealed it was all an experiment, the students were devastated. Some wept. Others refused to believe it wasn't real. The experiment ended, but the message lingered. Authoritarianism doesn't require monsters, just ordinary people eager to belong. How many times since then has history repeated that same 5-day lesson? In the gray years of the Cold War, Soviet researchers sought to understand the limits of human endurance. They locked prisoners in sealed chambers, pumped full of experimental gas mixtures meant to keep them awake indefinitely. 4 days the subjects remained lucid, talking, singing, begging for rest. Then came the hallucinations, the screaming, and finally the silence. Reports described delusions, self-mutilation, paranoia, and sudden, inexplicable deaths. Some claimed the participants tore their own flesh in madness. Others said they whispered to something that wasn't there. Official records remain unclear. Soviet archives deny the experiment ever existed, but fragments of documentation and witness testimonies suggest otherwise. Maybe the truth was buried to protect secrets. Or maybe it was buried because the experiment never really ended. Science promises progress. But progress without morality becomes its own form of madness. Every experiment began with a question. Curiosity, ambition, the search for knowledge. But what it uncovered was something older, darker, and far more human. Because when the mind becomes the subject and suffering becomes data, one question always remains. How far will we go before we realize the experiment has already begun?